For 3,000 years, one object has haunted kings, obsessed treasure hunters, and inspired entire religions to build their identity around a single question. Where did it go? Not a legend, not a myth invented for entertainment, but a real, physically described piece of furniture that vanished from recorded history so completely that empires searched for it and found nothing. And now, in the hill country of a land soaked in 3 millennia of war, archaeologists say they may have finally found the ground it once stood on. Not in Jerusalem, not in Ethiopia, not buried beneath a mountain in Jordan where ancient legend long insisted it was hidden. Somewhere, almost nobody was looking. To understand why this discovery matters, you have to understand what the Ark of the Covenant actually was, stripped of the Hollywood mythology that turned it into a weapon that melts faces. According to the book of Exodus, the Ark was commissioned by Moses himself, built to precise specifications handed down according to the text, directly from God on Mount Sinai. It was a wooden chest, roughly the size of a small coffee table, constructed from acacia wood and completely overlaid inside and out with pure gold. 2 golden cherubim, winged figures, set facing each other on its lid. They are wings, stretching upward and toward one another, forming what the Israelites believed was the literal throne room of the divine presence on earth. Inside the chest, according to Hebrew scripture, were the 2 stone tablets bearing the 10 Commandments, along with, at different points in the biblical narrative, a jar of manna, the staff of Aaron. This was not simply a religious artifact. It was described as the single most sacred object in the unseen. Israelite world, so dangerous in its holiness that only specially consecrated priests, the Levites, were permitted to carry it, and only using long poles slid through golden rings on its sides, because touching the ark directly was believed to be fatal. The ark's story begins in the wilderness, carried by the Israelites during their 40 years of wandering after the exodus from Egypt, an event most conservative biblical scholars date to around 1445 BCE, though the exact dating remains debated among historians and archaeologists to this day. The ark led the Israelites into battle. It supposedly caused the walls of Jericho to fall after being carried around the city for 7 days. It parted the Jordan River, according to the book of Joshua, allowing the Israelites to cross into the Promised Land on dry ground. And once that conquest was underway, the ark needed a permanent home, at least for a while, before Jerusalem existed as Israel's religious capital. That home was a place called Shiloh. Shiloh sat in the hill country of Ephraim, north of what would eventually become Jerusalem, and according to the book of Joshua, it was there that the portable sanctuary known as the tabernacle, the tent structure that housed the ark, was formally erected once the Israelite tribes had settled the land. This wasn't a footnote. Shiloh functioned as Israel's central place of worship for a documented period of well over 3 centuries, according to the biblical chronology, longer than the United States has existed as a nation. It was in Shiloh that the priest Eli served, and where a young boy named Samuel, later Israel's most consequential prophet, was raised in the shadow of the sanctuary, eventually hearing what Scripture describes as the voice of God calling him in the night. Shiloh was not a footnote in Israel's origin story, it was the origin story. But Shiloh's time as Israel's religious center ended in catastrophe. According to the first book of Samuel, the Israelites, desperate in a losing war against the Philistines, made the decision to carry the ark itself onto the battlefield, believing its presence would guarantee victory. It did not. The Israelites were routed, the ark was captured by the Philistines, and Eli's own sons, who had carried it into battle, were killed. When Eli received the news, the text says he fell backward from his seat and died from his shock. Archaeological excavations at Shiloh have uncovered a destruction layer from the same general period, a layer of ash and collapsed, burnt architecture consistent with a violent conflagration, which many scholars connect to this Philistine assault described in the biblical account, sometimes referred to as the Battle of Ebenezer in the 11th century BCE. The ark's journey did not end there. According to the biblical narrative, its presence proved catastrophic for the Philistines too, associated in the text with a series of plagues and disasters that convinced them to send it back, eventually finding a home in a town called Kiriath Jearim, where it remained for roughly 20 years before King David finally brought it to Jerusalem. It was David's son, Solomon, who built the first temple and placed the ark inside the innermost chamber, the Holy of Holies, where it remained, according to most historical reconstructions, for centuries, until Jerusalem fell to the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II in 586 BCE. The Babylonians destroyed the temple, and after that moment, the ark simply disappears from the historical and biblical record. No text describes its destruction. No text describes it being carried off as plunder, unlike the temple's other treasures, which the Babylonians cataloged and took. It is simply gone, and that silence is precisely what has fueled 30 centuries of searching. Theories about where the ark ended up range from the plausible to the wildly speculative, and separating serious historical inquiry from folklore is essential if you want to understand this story honestly. One of the oldest and most persistent traditions comes from the second book of Maccabees, a Jewish historical text written centuries after the Babylonian destruction, which Ciel aims that the prophet Jeremiah, warned in advance of the coming catastrophe, took the ark and hid it in a cave on Mount Nebo, on the eastern side of the Jordan River, in what is now the modern nation of Jordan, sealing the entrance so that it would remain hidden until God chose to reveal it again. No physical evidence of the ark has ever been found there, and most historians treat this account as later theological reflection rather than a reliable historical record. But it remains one of the most cited traditions in the search. A far more elaborate tradition comes from Ethiopia, where the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church maintains, with total religious conviction, that the actual Ark of the Covenant currently resides in the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in the city of Axum. According to Ethiopian tradition, recorded in a medieval text called the Kebra Nagast, the Ark was brought to Ethiopia by Menelik, the son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, who is said to have taken it from Jerusalem during a visit to his father. A single guardian monk is designated to watch over the Ark in Axum, living out his life in seclusion, and no outsider, not archaeologists, not journalists, not even most Ethiopian clergy, has ever been permitted to see it directly. This makes independent verification impossible, and Western historians remain divided, with most treating the Ethiopian claim as a powerful and deeply held national and religious tradition rather than a historically documented fact, given the near total absence of corroborating evidence outside the tradition itself. Then there's Jerusalem itself and the Temple Mount, where some researchers have long believed the Ark might still be hidden in a chamber or tunnel system beneath the mount, sealed away either before the Babylonian destruction or during later upheavals, including the eventual Roman destruction of the Second Temple, PL in 70 CE. Because the Temple Mount is one of the most politically and religiously sensitive sites on Earth, sitting at the center of ongoing tension between Jewish, Muslim, and Christian claims, serious archaeological excavation beneath it is essentially impossible, which means this theory, however historically plausible on paper, cannot currently be tested. And then, inevitably, there's the noise. In 2025, a resurfaced declassified CIA document from a Cold War-era program involving so-called remote viewing, individuals who claimed they could psychically perceive distant objects, briefly went viral online, with the document describing a container matching the Ark's description, supposedly located somewhere in the Middle East. This was not new information. It was a Cold War intelligence experiment from the 1980s with no scientific verification behind it, resurfacing decades later as clickbait. And it illustrates exactly how much misinformation surrounds this topic. Real archaeology, the kind grounded in stratigraphy, carbon dating, and peer review, tends to move much slower and much less dramatically than viral headlines suggest. Which brings us back to Shiloh, and to the actual discovery driving renewed attention to this ancient mystery. Since 2017, an archaeological team, led by Dr. Scott Stripling, Director of Excavations at Shiloh and affiliated with the Associates for Biblical Research, has been conducting systematic seasonal digs at the site, treating the biblical text not as a devotional document to be taken purely on faith, but as a historical source to be tested against physical evidence. That approach is itself controversial in the field. Biblical archaeology has long been split between scholars, sometimes labeled minimalists, who argue that much of the biblical narrative before the era of King David cannot be historically verified and should be treated with heavy skepticism, and those who believe the text, while certainly containing theological interpretation, is also rooted in genuine historical memory worth investigating on the ground. Stripling identifies clearly with the latter camp, and he has been transparent that this shapes his excavation strategy, beginning with the text and then searching for physical confirmation. What his team has found, season after season, is difficult to dismiss outright, even for skeptics. Early excavations uncovered massive quantities of animal bone deposits, ultimately totaling more than 100,000 bones, predominantly from sheep, goats, and cattle, the exact animals specified in the biblical sacrificial system, with a notably high proportion coming specifically from the right side of the animals' bodies, which mirrors a detail in the Hebrew Bible's instructions for priestly sacrifice, where the right thigh was designated as a priestly portion. In subsequent seasons, the team uncovered 3 stone horns, the corner projections from a 4-horned altar, a design also directly specified in the biblical text for sacrificial altars, and remarkably rare in the archaeological record, with only a small handful of comparable examples ever found across the entire region. But the discovery generating the most attention centers on a monumental stone structure the team has been slowly uncovering within Shiloh's fortification walls, distinct from an area sometimes shown to tourists as the traditional tabernacle location. This building, dated by associated pottery to the Iron Age Thorn period, roughly the 12th and 11th centuries BCE, aligns on a precise east to west axis and is internally divided by a large wall into two unequal sections, following what Stripling describes as a 2-to-1 ratio, which corresponds to the proportions given in the biblical description of the tabernacle, where a larger outer chamber, the holy place, stood in exact geometric relationship to a smaller inner chamber, the Holy of Holies, the specific space where the ark itself would have resided. Ted. In the most recent excavation season, the team uncovered the building's southern wall, finally revealing its complete footprint. And according to Stripling, that footprint strengthens rather than weakens the case that this structure functioned as a major religious complex precisely matching the physical description recorded in the Hebrew Bible. It's important to be precise here about what has and hasn't actually been claimed, because headlines have a tendency to blur the line between finding a location and finding an object. Nobody, including Stripling himself, claims to have found the Ark of the Covenant. What his team argues they may have found is the architectural footprint of the sanctuary structure that once housed it, the physical location where, according to the biblical narrative, the Ark itself sat for over 3 centuries before its capture by the Philistines. That distinction matters enormously. Finding a foundation is not the same as finding the object that once sat inside it, particularly because the tabernacle described in Exodus was fundamentally a tent, constructed from animal skins, linen curtains, and wooden frames, materials that would have decomposed completely within the archaeological record thousands of years ago. Stripling has been candid about this himself in past interviews, noting that he never expected to literally excavate the fabric structure, only the more permanent stone platform and supporting architecture that later grew up around it as Shiloh transitioned from a temporary desert shrine into a settled, centuries-long religious capital. This is also, genuinely, the unexpected part of the story. For most of the last century, popular imagination fixated on Jerusalem, on Ethiopia, on hidden chambers and secret caves, treating the search for the Ark as a search for a single dramatic hiding place where it was smuggled away in secrecy. Shiloh represents something different entirely. It's not a hiding place, it's the opposite. It's the Ark's original, publicly known, centuries-long home, a place the Bible names openly and repeatedly, sitting in plain historical view the entire time, simply waiting for archaeologists to dig in the right spot with the right methodology. If Stripling's team is correct about the structure's identity, the significance isn't that some secret vault has finally been cracked open. It's that a site everyone already knew about, described explicitly in ancient texts for 3,000 years, may finally be yielding physical confirmation of exactly what those texts described happening there. That said, intellectual honesty demands acknowledging the real skepticism surrounding these claims within the archaeological community. Shiloh has actually been excavated multiple times before Stripling's team ever arrived. A Danish expedition worked the site across 3 seasons between 1926 and 1932. Israeli archaeologist Israel Finkelstein of Tel Aviv University, one of the most prominent and rigorously empirical voices in biblical archaeology, led major excavations there in the early 1980s and uncovered substantial evidence of cultic or ritual activity at the site spanning centuries without ever claiming definitive confirmation of the tabernacle's exact location. Finkelstein himself has proposed that if a tabernacle structure exists at Shiloh, it may actually sit beneath the site's summit, an area not yet fully excavated by Stripling's team, meaning the debate over the structure's precise identity and location remains genuinely open, even among archaeologists who broadly agree Shiloh was religiously significant. More broadly, some scholars in the field have expressed pointed skepticism about Stripling's interpretive approach itself, arguing that starting an excavation with a specific biblical claim in mind and then searching for confirming evidence risks a kind of confirmation bias, where ambiguous findings get interpreted through a predetermined lens rather than allowed to speak on their own terms. This is a legitimate methodological criticism that applies broadly across biblical archaeology, not unique to Stripling, and it's worth taking seriously rather than dismissing as mere academic gatekeeping. Archaeology, done well, requires holding conclusions loosely until the physical evidence becomes overwhelming, and even Stripling himself has acknowledged in interviews that he cannot yet claim, in his words, 100% certainty that the structure his team uncovered definitively served as the tabernacle's platform, only that the growing body of evidence is, in his assessment, consistent with that conclusion and difficult to explain as pure coincidence. What nobody disputes, however, is that Shiloh was a genuine, significant, long-occupied religious site in ancient Israel, corroborated across multiple independent excavations, spanning nearly a century of archaeological work, and that the specific combination of findings, the east-west oriented monumental structure with its 2-to-1 internal division, the altar horns, The enormous quantity of sacrificial pattern animal bone deposits and pottery consistently dated to the correct historical window represents a genuinely compelling convergence of evidence, even for scholars who remain cautious about declaring the mystery definitively solved. Archaeology rarely offers absolute proof of anything from this deep in history. It offers probability, accumulated through patient, careful excavation, layer by layer, season after season, and by that standard, what's happening at Shiloh represents one of the more substantial developments in biblical archaeology in recent memory, regardless of where the Ark itself ultimately ended up after it left that site roughly 3,000 years ago. So where does that leave the actual Ark, the golden chest itself, wherever it went after the Philistines captured it and Shiloh burned? The honest answer is that we still don't know, and we may never know with certainty. The try. The yell of the Ark left behind grows fainter the further it travels from Shiloh, through Kiriath Jearim, into Solomon's temple, and finally into the silence of 586 BCE, when Jerusalem fell and the historical record simply stops mentioning it. Every theory that follows, Ethiopia, Mount Nebo, the Temple Mount, exists in the space that silence created, filled in by tradition, faith, speculation, and in some cases, Utright fabrication designed to generate clicks rather than illuminate history. What makes the Shiloh excavation different and worth paying attention to isn't that it claims to solve that mystery. It's that it approaches the question with actual field methodology, transparent uncertainty, and physical evidence you can independently examine, rather than legend passed down through unverifiable tradition or a viral repost of a Cold War psychic experiment. Maybe the Ark itself was destroyed in Jerusalem's fall, melted down or lost in the chaos of Babylonian conquest, its story ending not in a hidden cave, but in ordinary historical violence, the same fate that befell countless other treasures of the ancient world. Maybe it really did make its way to Ethiopia, carried by tradition and faith across centuries and continents, resting now behind the walls of a church guarded by a single monk who will never let the world verify the claim. Maybe it's still beneath Jerusalem, sealed in rock nobody has been permitted to excavate. Or maybe the most important discovery was never going to be the object itself, but the ground it once stew, Dion, in a quiet hill town in ancient Ephraim, where 3 centuries of Israelite worship left behind bones, stone, and the outline of a building that, brick by brick, season by season, is finally being pulled back into the light after 3,000 years of silence. The search continues, and archaeologists are already planning future excavation seasons at Shiloh to further expose the site's summit and resolve some of the remaining questions about the structure's exact function and dating. Whatever they find next, this much is already clear. The story of the Ark of the Covenant isn't a closed chapter of ancient mythology. It's an active, ongoing archaeological investigation, still being written in real time, one excavation season at a time, to really grasp why the disappearance of the Ark became one of history's most enduring obsessions. You have to understand what was actually lost when Jerusalem fell in 586 BCE. This wasn't simply the loss of an object. For the ancient Israelites, the Ark functioned as the physical anchor point of their entire relationship with the divine, the place where, according to the text of Exodus, God told Moses he would meet with him and speak from between the 2 golden cherubim. Its absence from the Second Temple, rebuilt decades later after the Babylonian exile ended, is documented by multiple ancient sources. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century CED, described the Holy of Holies in the Second Temple as completely empty, containing nothing at all, a striking detail given how central the Ark had been to Israelite worship for centuries prior. This means that whatever happened to it happened during that 50-year window of Babylonian conquest and exile, and nobody who survived to write about it afterward seems to have known, or been willing to record, exactly where it went. This gap in the record is exactly what allowed so many competing traditions to take root, each shaped by the particular community that preserved it. The Ethiopian tradition, for instance, isn't simply a folk tale invented for tourism. It's deeply woven into Ethiopian national and religious identity, reinforced by the fact that Ethiopia's ancient Ristian kingdom, one of the oldest Christian states in the world, converted in the 4th century CE, centuries before most of Europe, and has maintained an unbroken Orthodox tradition ever since. Every major Ethiopian Orthodox church, and there are thousands across the country, contains a replica of the Ark called a tabbat, which is treated with such sanctity that it, not the crucifix or any other symbol, is what gets processed through the streets during major religious festivals. Whether or not the actual Ark sits in Axum, the tradition itself reveals just how deeply this object shaped an entire civilization's self-understanding, independent of the biblical land where the story began. The Temple Mount theory deserves a bit more context too, because it isn't purely speculative. Jewish tradition, recorded in the Mishnah, a collection of oral law compiled around 200 CE, actually describes a specific stone beneath where the ark once sat, called the foundation stone, believed by later rabbinic sources to still exist beneath the site today. Some ultra-Orthodox and religious Zionist researchers have long theorized about sealed chambers or tunnels beneath the Temple Mount platform where priests may have hidden the ark before Jerusalem's destruction, drawing on later rabbinic legends describing exactly this kind of concealment. The problem, as mentioned before, is access. The Temple Mount today sits under the administration of Jerusalem Islamic Waqf, and it houses the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque, among the holiest sites in Islam. Any excavation there is politically explosive, and the Israeli government has historically restricted archaeological digging on the mount itself to avoid triggering unrest. This means the theory, unlike the Shiloh excavation, simply cannot be tested using modern archaeological methods, and probably won't be for the foreseeable future, regardless of how compelling the textual argument might be on paper. It's also worth addressing why this story keeps resurfacing in popular culture with such intensity, because that pattern isn't accidental. The 1981 film Raiders of the Lost Ark, starring Harrison Ford as Indiana Jones, introduced an entire generation to the Ark as a supernatural weapon capable of melting the faces of anyone who dared open it without reverence, a dramatization with no basis in the biblical text, but one that fused permanently with the public imagination anyway. Scott Stripling has actually been informally nicknamed a real-life Indiana Jones by some outlets covering his work at Shiloh, a comparison he has addressed directly, noting that unlike the fictional character, his actual work involves years of patient, unglamorous excavation, painstaking pottery, analysis, and careful stratigraphic documentation, not chases through booby-trapped temples. That gap between the myth and the method is itself part of the story. Real archaeology moves in centimeters and seasons, not single dramatic reveals, and that slowness is precisely why credible discoveries take years to build a convincing case, while sensational claims, like the resurfaced CIA remote viewing document, can spread across social media in a single afternoon with no evidence behind them at all. What ties all of this together, the Ethiopian church, the sealed chambers beneath Jerusalem, the excavation at Shiloh, and even the exaggerated Hollywood mythology, is a single, remarkably consistent human impulse. Across 3,000 years, across different continents, religions, and levels of scientific rigor, people have refused to let this object simply disappear into history unexplained. Whether driven by faith, national identity, scholarly curiosity, or simple fascination with the unknown, the search for the Ark has never actually stopped, only changed shape, generation after generation, still unfolding today in the dust of a hillside in ancient Ephraim. If this kind of deep dive into biblical history and archaeology is the kind of thing you want more of, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next investigation. Drop a comment below with which theory you find most convincing. Shiloh, Ethiopia, or somewhere still waiting to be uncovered. And share this video with anyone who loves a 3,000-year-old mystery as much as you do.